The majority of school blank and mass blank that are happening across this country are being committed by white boys. So let me ask you this. If you're a parent, white women, what are we doing?
And because men are the problem, men need to do a better job of coming up with the solutions.
This is fine. This is normal. A tragedy happened in Georgia last week, and TikTok is responding in simply the most unhinged way imaginable. We're going to break it all down in today's episode of the Brad vs. Everyone podcast, my daily show where I take on the craziest ideas from across the internet and across our politics, all from a center-right, independent perspective. If you're new here, please do consider subscribing and sticking around, and regardless, do hit that like button as we go along to reward my suffering through all this stupidity, and do comment with your thoughts. I do read the comments, and I pick a few to respond to in every episode, and if you leave your comment with a super chat or a super thanks, I'll definitely read it in the next episode, unless you write something naughty or inappropriate, which some of you do like to do. So guys, before we get into the podcast today, I do just want to bring you guys a sad announcement. Over the weekend, my dog, my beagle, Reggie, did pass away. And it was somewhat unexpected in that we didn't anticipate it happening that exact night, Saturday night. However, we've known that it was coming because he, over the last 6 months, has been dealing with a degenerative neurospinal issue and slowly becoming more and more paralyzed and having more health issues. So we've been taking care of him, and it's been, we've known this was coming, but it's really hard. I'll be honest. It kind of comes in waves. So sometimes, like even at the moment, I kind of feel fine because I'm keeping busy and preparing the podcast and doing my work. And I'm going to keep doing that. I don't want to take time off and wallow in my sadness, but it comes in waves. And sometimes it just hits me like a brick. It's only been like not even 48 hours now that I'm recording this since he passed. And I was with him every day, all day, and everywhere around the house. I just see reminders of him, and it's going to be really hard. And I don't think I'm going to be the same, but I do think I'm going to be okay. And so I might not be 100% myself or kind of as happy or funny or sassy for a while. I don't know. Maybe you won't be able to tell, but I did just want to be honest with you guys. And I did just want to let you know what was going on with me, be 100% transparent and real. But I am going to keep bringing you the show, keep connecting, keep making content because I do like to stay busy. I really enjoy what I do, but it is, I'm going through a hard time. Obviously, there's worse things that happen in the world, but for me, Reggie was my everyday companion. We had a special bond. We got him like 4.5 years ago. He had been really traumatized. He had really bad PTSD. And so at first he just would never come out from under the bed and would hide and would shake and was scared all the time. And over the years, he got more and more comfortable to the point where by the end I would hold him like a baby and rock him, and he would fall asleep with his head on my chest. And he was so comfortable and trusted us. And it was really sweet. And I'm trying to focus on the positive so I don't just get really sad about it, that we had so many amazing years with him and that we gave him such a positive stretch in his life after having, we don't really know what it was like, but having a really hard life at first. So, I don't know what else to say. I know a lot of you have probably lost pets and understand what it's like, but I just wanted to let you guys know about this so you understand where I'm at. And that my content might not be the same, or I might not be as happy or funny or whatever. And I appreciate you guys. I love what I do, and I appreciate having this to kind of give my life meaning and keep me excited and energized even as I go through a really hard time. So thank you all. And I'm just going to keep it moving and get into the rest of today's podcast. So now on to our main topic for the day, which is unfortunately an incredibly tragic one. Last week, 4 people, 2 teachers and 2 students, were killed in a tragic school shooting at Appalachia High School in Winder, Georgia. It was a really evil and senseless act carried out by a male 14-year-old student that understandably has shocked the public and made national news. Familiar debates about gun control bubbled up in mainstream media, and scrutiny continues to be placed on what seems like massive failures by the school to respond to warning signs, as well as tremendously irresponsible and dangerous decisions the shooter's father reportedly made, like buying his mentally ill teenager an AR 15, even though he knew the FBI had investigated the boy for threatening a school shooting in the past. But on TikTok, a very different and deeply unhinged conversation is taking place. I think it's important that we're all aware of the ideas and arguments that are gaining purchase among young people and spreading like wildfire online. So we're going to go through some of these most viral and frankly crazy videos about the aftermath of this tragedy and discuss them at length in today's episode. First, one viral TikTok tried to blame this tragedy on men categorically, openly saying that men are the problem. Let's take a listen.
Men are the problem. Hear me out.
Oh?
Over the last few days, there have been very specific, horrific, and tragic incidents that have occurred that got me thinking about the root, and the root is male entitlement that then manifests into male violence. Now, there are separate and serious conversations that need to be had about white national domestic femicide, but at the root of it is male entitlement. Because why a 14-year-old boy who was just being investigated by the FBI just last year over allegations of wanting to pew-pew up a school would be gifted an AR-15 from his own father for Christmas is beyond me.
So, men are the problem is such a wild thing to say about the actions of one individual 14-year-old boy. I agree that the father giving him a gun in this context was insane and irresponsible and frankly potentially criminal behavior, and he's being investigated for that. So, I agree with that portion. Obviously, that's insane. But what any of this has to do with men as an entire category of people or of male entitlement. I mean, this was not some strong alpha male who'd been embodied by toxic masculinity. This was a traumatized, disturbed young teenage boy who had been really horrifically treated. Now, none of that, of course, justifies or explains his actions in any way, really, but it's like the idea that this was rooted in men or masculinity is not substantiated based on what we know about the facts. And regardless, there's something sick about responding to the demented actions of an individual by immediately casting blame on an entire group of people. In any other context, we would really see this as divisive and wrong, right? If we saw one horrible shooting carried out by a black person, started talking about this is a black problem, people would be like, whoa, that is not okay and not fair to black people. They're all individuals. You can't hold them collective based on some immutable non-choice of a trait that they have in common. Well, the same thing is true for men. And it's not okay to demonize an entire group of people because of the actions of certain individuals. Now, is it true that men commit most of these atrocities? Yes. And I'm open to discussing why that might be, but we have to be careful to do so without demonizing entire groups or assigning collective guilt or blame for the actions of any one individual. That kind of thing is always wrong and always unfair, and it also always puts people on the defensive and divides people. So it's really disheartening to see this kind of thing just spreading all across TikTok. This individual did have more thoughts to share.
Bring up the fact that these young men are being coddled into entitlement. And when they can't have their way, they then manifest that into violence towards other people. And while I would like to emphasize that there is nobody more entitled than the white male who has been radicalized through the patriarchy, misogyny, online social media content, and propaganda, it is an issue across the board with male entitlement. The crime issue that is happening in Chicago and many other places is still a male entitlement issue. Because why are we all the victims to your irresponsible coping mechanisms, your unresolved trauma, and your suppressed emotions? And because men are the problem, men need to do a better job of coming up with the solutions.
So again, I am not totally closed off to the conversation about like what is leading some individual young men out of literally hundreds of millions of men to commit such depraved acts and atrocities. We should absolutely interrogate and investigate and try to remedy that in any way we can. But to then reach this conclusion that men are the problem and that men have some particular obligation to solve this, no, I don't. I bear as a man zero responsibility for this actions of some 14-year-old boy in Georgia. This is a insane connection that we would rightly cry bigoted and objectively hateful in any other context. I mean, this individual in the long video, which I didn't show you all of, talks about Chicago as an example and how you want to talk about how black people are responsible for all violence in Chicago, then they're still men. Like, no, you're missing the point. The point is that it would be deeply evil and racist and wrong to assign collective guilt to black people for the actions of a black drive-by shooter in Chicago, but you seem to be okay with doing the same thing to white men and not realizing the cognitive dissonance there. Like, it's not making sense. The math is not mathing. You are so inconsistent and engaging in the exact kind of behavior, the demonization of groups, that is so just sums up everything that's wrong with the modern identity politics cult and the collectivist worldview more broadly. Men don't have any particular burden to solve this issue. All of society does. We should all care equally about the horrific tragedies and the senseless loss of life of children and teachers. There's no particular obligation of some groups over others to care about this or solve this because of their immutable demographic traits. What are y'all saying? I understand that emotions run hot in the aftermath of this kind of tragedy. I really do. But the discourse about men and male identity, this is just one video of many on this app after this incident, is just shocking and deranged stuff. And of course, in a twist that should surprise no one, not only did some TikTokers blame men collectively, they also blamed white people and white men collectively for the actions of this one teenage boy, who happened, I guess, yes, to be white. Let's take a listen to another one of these wild TikTok videos. By the way, guys, I'm not showing you random content from people with 5 followers. All the videos I'm showing you have hundreds of thousands of likes and millions of views. Very, very popular content. Let's take a look.
I'm sorry if you think it's too early to politicize what happened in Georgia yesterday, but I will not allow the NRA to dictate how I talk about this issue that is impacting all of us. The majority of school blank and mass blank that are happening across this country are being committed by white boys. So let me ask you this. If you're a parent, white women, what are we doing?
Excuse me? The text on screen says, "This is a white problem." No, babe. No, it is not. White people as some nebulous collective doesn't even really exist, first of all, but have no responsibility for the actions of a handful of individuals out of hundreds of millions of people. That is demented logic. Again, that's like saying that black people collectively have some sort of responsibility for the actions of one drive-by black shooter in Chicago. No, they don't. We would rightfully call that racist and bigoted. It's not somehow different because you just swap out the race from black to white and apply the logic in a different situation. It's still the same ignorant and bigoted logic, babe. This is just such a divisive and irresponsible way to respond to these kinds of tragedies. But she continued as she started. Let's take a listen to more of her video.
Yes, this is 100% a pew-pew, access to pew-pew problem, but as a culture, we are raising violent human beings. The overexposure and glorification of violence in our households has to stop. You have got to get a hold of what we are showing, teaching, exposing our children to, and being better, more present parents, because this is a problem in white households. So if we are white parents, we have to do something about it.
Oh my. There's a lot to unpack here, but first off, her math is not mathing. She says this is 100% an access to guns problem, which it's not, and we can talk about that because decades ago we had ample access to firearms, but not the same degree of regular shootings, so clearly something else has changed. However, it can't simultaneously be 100% an access to guns problem and also a white people problem, because then it wouldn't be 100% an access to guns problem. Like, literally, your math is not mathing. Oh my goodness, the incoherence on display here is quite something. But of course, that doesn't stop millions of impressionable people on TikTok from lapping up this content. Gosh. But I just fundamentally reject this idea that white families have to do something about this because it's a white problem. No, we don't. It has nothing to do with us. Just because first off, white is a very vague and not really a category, but let's say that it is, for argument's sake. I have no responsibility. My family has nothing to do with the actions of some 14-year-old boy in Georgia. Nothing to do with us. And if you're saying we somehow have guilt or blame or responsibility for his actions because we share a skin pigment, then you, my friend, are doing racism. You're doing bigotry. You're doing guilt by association in a way that you would simply never apply to any other demographic group of people without immediately realizing that what you're saying is bigoted and ignorant. Individuals are responsible for their actions. This individual in George's family is very much responsible for the reckless decisions they allegedly made and not seeing all the massive red flags that we've reportedly heard about. They're responsible. Random white families in other parts of the country are not. And that is a wild and just irresponsible allegation or suggestion to make. It's really giving, I'm one of the good white people. See, I am a white person, but I know that white people are bad and have so much work to do. Please like me. It's really pathetic to see white people who kind of flagellate themselves like this before the altar of woke identity politics, hoping to be successful and win the love of people who genuinely will hate you regardless and will demonize you regardless. Like, I don't know what you're going for here, but whatever it is, it's not working. Up next, some of the TikTokers who weighed in on this issue just pushed some of the same tired, trite talking points about gun control that really don't address this problem or make a whole lot of sense. And chief among those was Spence Wah, who is an oddball TikToker, but it does have charm and can be really funny. But when he wades into politics, the analysis is pretty kindergarten level, frankly. So let's take a look at what he had to say.
And again, the gun used yesterday was an AR platform weapon. Who the needs an AR weapon? Yes, as Americans, we have a right to bear arms, but when they wrote the Constitution, they weren't talking about weapons that could incite massacres. They were talking about weapons that took 30 seconds to reload. That means 2 shots per minute. Not an AR-15 style weapon that can shoot off 45 rounds per minute. That means in 1791, when the Second Amendment was ratified, it would take about 23 colonists with 1 musket each to do the same amount of damage that one person with an AR weapon can do in 1 minute today. That isn't normal. Like, that isn't right. 8 students and 1 teacher was hospitalized, all of whom are expected to survive. Thank God. But this shouldn't have been able to happen in the first place. Why does a child have access to a weapon like that? Why do people have access to weapons like that? Those weapons are literally meant for mass killing. And if those weapons didn't exist when the Second Amendment was written, then they shouldn't be included when referring to the Second Amendment. Plain and simple.
No, babe, Spencer, stick to screaming about random things and influencer things, because leave the politics and the constitutional law to people who have basic familiarity with it. This argument is really, really dumb. Even a sophisticated progressive thinker would never argue that just because AR-15s didn't exist when the Constitution was written and ratified, they don't apply. The Second Amendment doesn't apply to AR-15s. Really, babe? Think about the First Amendment, for example. The First Amendment, when that was written, computers, phones, the radio, TikTok, none of these things existed. Doesn't mean the First Amendment doesn't protect them. The Constitution lays out principles that are then applied throughout time. So the same way that freedom of speech now would protect your right to publish an ebook, even though ebooks didn't exist in 1776, well, the Second Amendment established the right to bear arms, and at that time referred to arms that were in common use, the same kind of firearms and technology, whether it was cannons or muskets, that a militia would have, so too could private citizens. And so the analogous thing there for the AR-15 would actually be perfectly logical, that you would be able to have one under the Second Amendment. And just because it didn't exist when the Constitution was ratified is irrelevant, babe. And if you were familiar with Constitutional Law 101, you wouldn't embarrass yourself with these kinds of arguments publicly. So maybe read up on it before you dive into these debates or something, because this is not a good look. And making this Georgia tragedy about AR-15s more broadly makes absolutely no sense. 4 people, 2 teachers and 2 students, were killed by this evil act of violence. But my friend, you could kill 4 people with a handgun, with a shotgun, with a hunting rifle, with really any kind of gun. The idea that, well, being an AR-15 is of particular note is just not really logical. I mean, some of the most deadly school shootings in American history, like Columbine, killed far more people than this and were carried out with handguns. So making it about AR-15s makes no sense. As a statistical matter of fact, AR-15s are not the problem with gun violence in America. There are more than 16 million AR-15s in the United States, but according to FBI data, just a few hundred people every year are killed with rifles of any kind. More people are killed with bare fists or blunt objects. So statistically speaking, 99.99% of AR-15s aren't used to murder anybody, okay? So we've got to stop with this hysterical blame game and constitutional illiteracy trying to make this situation about the AR-15. In reality, we should be talking about the gross and reckless, irresponsible actions of this shooter's father, giving him a gun even though he was clearly mentally disturbed, and the school missing many massive red flags. But making this about a particular type of firearm is just not justified by facts or the statistical reality of the gun violence issue more broadly. This issue is also not about government funding for programs, but that didn't stop one viral TikTok from trying to assert that the reason we have these kinds of tragedies is because we're cutting funding to healthcare and education and food stamps, which is, of course, news to me that we're doing any such thing. But let's take a listen to another interesting video about this incident.
I'm so tired of hearing politicians call school violence senseless. Every single time a tragedy happens in a school, you have a row of politicians ready to go. Oh, this is so senseless. Oh, we don't know how this happened. You don't know how it happened? It happened because of you. Literally, every single time you sign a bill into law that reduces SNAP and reduces healthcare and reduces school funding and increases mass incarceration and increases mass deportation and doesn't protect housing, every single time you sign these violent bills into law, you're creating more violence in our schools. You reduce our school funding, you're increasing school violence. One hand they take NRA money, the other hand they hand out thoughts and prayers, and then at the same time they're saying to teachers, your children aren't meeting benchmarks. This school district isn't meeting benchmarks. This child isn't. How cruel and inhumane are you that you're going to look at a child that's coming to school without a pencil, without food at home, without housing, with a family that's at risk of deportation, a family member that's incarcerated, on and on and on. They're in the foster care system, anything. And you're going to look at that kid and you're going to say, you're not meeting your benchmark, as you reduce their funding and any access they have to any program that could help them. It's cruel, it's inhumane, and it's not senseless. They just don't want to take responsibility.
So this video really deeply disturbed me because this guy might not realize it, but he is essentially taking blame off the shoulders of the shooter, the sick individual who killed those 4 people, and putting it on to the shoulders of imaginary politicians who he imagines made decisions that don't exist about cutting funding to unrelated programs, and then left kids in a scenario of hopelessness that then actually almost no school shooters fit into this description. So he basically brought up a bunch of things that have nothing to do with anything, and then falsely claimed that funding to them has been slashed, and then took blame off the shooters and threw it onto the shoulders of imaginary politicians he invented. It's really quite a mind, to be frank, yet millions of people bought this hook, line, and sinker, even though it has no basis in reality. I feel like I'm listening to somebody who lives in an alternate universe, because there is no universe where anything he described is actually true or real. We can run through the list, and I'm going to put the graphs on screen. SNAP spending, food stamps, has more than doubled since 2018. It's only gone up. We haven't cut it at all. The nationwide public K-12 student spending per student per year has only gone up, even after you adjust for inflation. It's up thousands of dollars over the last 10 years. Healthcare spending has only gone up. Taxpayer spending on healthcare expenditures has just gone up. Since 2013, it's nearly doubled, right? So on almost every count, the things that he's describing aren't real or true, yet he's somehow still asserting them to blame imaginary politicians for the acts of a deranged, sick individual. It's just mental gymnastics of the highest order. Like, I hope you didn't pull something stretching so hard. But to spread this kind of fake information and cast blame based on imaginary realities is really irresponsible and disturbing, and just not an okay thing to do in the aftermath of a tragedy. Anyway, guys, kind of in conclusion to this topic, I just have to say there aren't easy answers. There's no one law we can pass that will make this problem go away or solve it. There's not one issue. Now, I could get into and do a whole podcast on things that I think would help this crisis, and I do think it's a really profound sickness and crisis, but I do know one thing for sure. Toxic and misinformed discourse that spreads ignorant talking points and constitutional illiteracy and fake news and demonizes entire groups of people who, based on the actions of individuals, this kind of stuff does not help and only makes things worse. What do you guys think? Are you kind of shocked to see what people on TikTok had to say in the aftermath of this tragedy, or is it unfortunately about what you expected? Please do let me know in the comments. And now I do have to spare a word for some conservative internet personalities like Libs of TikTok and the organization Gays Against Groomers, who spread blatant fake news and misinformation in the aftermath of the Georgia shooting that I do feel the need to correct and call out. So after the tragic shooting in Georgia, a bunch of fake information started to spread online, suggesting that the shooter was trans. A clearly, in my view at least, clearly fake profile, social media profile with she, they pronouns and like pro Kamala and other things for the shooter was spread, and people didn't really bother to check if it was real before just spreading it. And then massive accounts put out statements attributing this act of violence to essentially LGBT people or trans people or to the pro-LGBT agenda with no basis in reality for that claim. So one individual who has 2 million followers on X, formerly Twitter, posted a picture of the Georgia shooter, which shows him with somewhat long hair, and said, quote, "Every child killed in a mass shooting in the last 2 years was killed by a transgender shooter." Fact check. False. We'll get into that, but that's not true. Yet this person shared it to millions of people nonetheless. Similarly, Libs of TikTok shared the shooter's mugshot and a CNN screenshot that says the shooter, quote, "expressed frustration with the acceptance of transgender people," and then said, Libs of TikTok wrote, "It's time to have a national conversation about the modern LGBTQ movement radicalizing youth into becoming violent activists." Now, that language from the CNN article is kind of sloppy and unclear, but I wouldn't read it to think that this person was a trans activist who was mad about trans people not being accepted. If anything, I'd read that language. I'd be uncertain, so I wouldn't run with it, but I'd probably read it as, oh, they were upset that trans people weren't more accepted, which CNN has now clarified the article. Now the updated version makes it clear that this individual, the Georgia shooter, was actually expressing anti-trans animus online. But Libs of TikTok has left this post up and not issued any sort of correction. Gays Against Groomers' official Twitter account put out a statement making a similar claim that they've now deleted, but as far as I can tell, there was no follow-up correction or apology for spreading fake information. I really take strong issue with this, guys, because what you have here is right-wing accounts who seized on unverified, salacious information to attempt to attribute the actions of an individual to an entire movement they dislike, that they're working against. And it is sick, it's twisted, right? In the same way that if there was a shooter who, for example, committed an atrocity and was motivated by anti-LGBT animus, the woke people who would say, this is the fault of Libs of TikTok, I would disagree with them. Well, now we have Libs of TikTok doing the same thing in reverse, saying, this is a pro-trans shooter, we need to talk about the LGBT community being responsible for violence. You're literally doing the collective guilt woke thing in reverse. And it's deeply wrong. It would be wrong even if the information you were spreading was true. But when you're doing it and spreading false and fake information, that's exponentially more evil and irresponsible of a use of your platform, of millions of followers that literally politicians follow and promote, and conservative media just amplifies constantly. It's incredibly reckless and disappointing stuff. And especially then, mistakes do happen, but you should delete the post, correct it, apologize, and blast that announcement as far as you can see. To leave it up and just move on is really detestable. I mean, what on earth? More importantly, though, this is why in the aftermath of these kinds of incidents, people need to be careful. They need to not just run with narratives or seize on unverified facts. Wait, take a beat, And don't just look to exploit these tragedies to own the libs or own the white men or own the conservatives. It's always wrong, whether it's woke people doing it or right-wing Twitter accounts doing it. It's not a healthy or constructive approach to these issues in any way. It's making our nation worse. It's dividing us, and it's spreading and misinforming people. It's really disheartening and alarming stuff, in my view. And I want to take a second to push back on this narrative that I see a lot from right-wing people, that trans shooters are an epidemic and the trans cult is brainwashing people into violence. This isn't really true. This is not really based in reality. A Reuters fact check of this claim pointed out that transgender individuals represent less than 1% of perpetrators in all mass shootings over the past decade, and about 2% involved in school shootings specifically. Limiting the search to the past 2 years yields 1 in 20, or 5%, of mass school shootings involving a transgender suspect. And despite the wild claims that have been spread online, there is no evidence that the Georgia shooter identified as transgender. Now, depending which number you look at, those numbers for trans shooters are either representative of the population or maybe slightly overrepresented, but it is just not true that we have some epidemic of trans mass shooters or anything of the sort. And more importantly, I want to stress to people on the right that even if they were to find some sort of statistical correlation, which doesn't really appear they have yet, or that I don't really think they will, that trans people were overrepresented in school shooters, it would still be wrong to blame all trans people or the trans community for that, or to say it's inherent to being trans, in the same way that it's wrong to say that just because 97 or whatever percent of school shooters are men, that it's a men problem, or that all men are responsible. That would still be wrong. You're honestly doing the woke identity politics logic in reverse. So conservatives need to put down this stupid argument and stop. You can disagree with trans people. You can disagree with the trans activist movement. I do it all the time, without essentially blood libeling them or attributing responsibility to violence to individuals who had nothing to do with it. That is really, really wrong and immoral, in my view. All right, guys, we're going to leave it there for now on all of this controversy related to this tragedy. Let me know in the comments what you think about everything we've discussed. And I am going to skip Brad versus TikTok today. It just doesn't feel quite right, given the seriousness of the subject matter of the rest of this episode. And also, we've spent plenty of time reacting to TikToks today. I don't need to lose any more brain cells. So I'm just going to go to your comments and then we'll wrap up this episode. One person writes, "I've said it once and I'll say it again. Calling that massive boondoggle the Inflation Reduction Act is like putting kerosene in a spray can and calling it a fire extinguisher." Yeah, it really is offensive. It bothers me so much that they made a multi-trillion-dollar spending spree on climate stuff, and they named it the Inflation Reduction Act. Like it didn't have much impact on inflation, but because the spending ended up costing way more than they expected, it actually grew the deficit, and if anything on the margins, probably increased inflation. So really offensive and ridiculous stuff. I do find it maddening. Another person said, Gen Z is getting more radical. When I was a teenager, I read this in a book and it stuck with me my entire life. Do nothing to others that you would not have them done to you. Yeah, I agree with this. And I think that people on the left and right in this increasingly toxic time need to keep this in mind, that you have to treat people how you want to be treated, and any powers you expand to own or destroy your political opponents will come back to bite you. Another person writes, "About the Inflation Act, I'm shocked and appalled. I thought I was a decently informed citizen, and the specifics of this flew right by me. I'm hurt. If I hadn't already been disillusioned, this would have done it. I'm done with politics. I hate this." Yeah, I'm sorry to make you feel that way, but it is warranted by the facts. So I do feel responsible to tell you that. And it is the kind of thing I wish more mainstream media and news would cover, but I guess it's just not as sensational as culture war stuff, so not everybody picks it up. But I do care, and I will keep bringing you that kind of stuff because it's important to me. Another person said, "I'm Gen Z and I'm profoundly conservative. These students are part of the stupid elites. The rest of Gen Z is fed up with that." Yes, there is a subset of Gen Z that's rebelling against the insanity, among which I count myself, and I'm so glad to hear you're a part of it. But the polling does show a majority of young people still hold really alarming views. So while I do think there has been a little bit of a turn against the woke excesses in Gen Z, like people joke about non-binary and roll their eyes at a lot of this stuff now, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So much for joining me. Please do make sure you're subscribed if you aren't yet. Do hit that like button and do comment with your thoughts. I do read the comments and I pick a few to respond to in every episode. And if you leave your comment with a super thanks or a super chat, I'll be sure to read it in the next episode. And with that, we'll talk again tomorrow.